Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley and the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. Choosing a college major can be daunting. For those of you who did this, I'm sure you remember the process. Personally, I changed my major a few times, at least partially because there was so much that I wanted to learn. But what if you could earn multiple degrees and explore a bunch of majors? How about 17 degrees? Sounds like a fantasy, but believe it or not, this is exactly what my guest on this episode did. Dr. Benjamin Bolger is known as a perpetual student and is the second most degreed individual in the history of the United States. He has studied in various fields and attended schools like Harvard, Stanford, Brown, Dartmouth, and Columbia. In fact, during the window of 2000 to 2004, he earned 6 different master's degrees. Ben currently works as a college admissions counselor, and he has appeared in many national newspapers like the New York Times and TV programs like the NBC Today Show. I had no idea what Ben would be like, and it turned out he was as likable as he is educated. It was so much fun to geek out with Ben on the topic of learning and all it can do for us. This is an unusual opportunity to listen to one of the most educated people on the planet as he talks about the benefits of being a perpetual learner. Dr. Benjamin Bolger, who has asked me to call him Ben, a hearty welcome to Super Psyched.
Thank you, Adam. It is a pleasure to be here, and I'm very honored to be on your show.
So great. The genesis of this is from the mouth of babes. My 14-year-old son asked me, Dad, do you know who the most educated person is in the country? Pretty much. Apparently there's somebody who has 30 degrees, but I said, no, I don't know who. And he said, Benjamin Bolger. And I looked you up kind of in disbelief. My son is just walking around with all kinds of arcane facts. And it's so fun to get to hear this boy. And when I looked you up, I realized there was no way I wasn't going to interview you. This had to happen. And then I called you on the phone, and lo and behold, not only are you a scholar, but you're also a really cool and nice person.
Well, that's a great introduction. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So let's talk about this. So to date, you've got 17 degrees under your belt. I'm just going to read them off. You've got an AA from Muskegon Community College. You've got a bachelor's from University of Michigan, where you actually attained a 4.0 at a very young age. You went to the University of Oxford, which many people have heard of. I believe that's also known as Hogwarts. You went to the University of Cambridge, got a master's there as well. Went to Stanford, got an MA there. Went to Teachers College, Columbia University. Graduate School of Architecture at Columbia University. Harvard University, Master of Design and Urban Planning. Brown University, Masters of Art. Dartmouth College, Master of Arts. Brandeis University, Master of Arts. Skidmore College, Master of Arts. Harvard University, Doctor of Design and Urban Planning. Ashland University, Master of Fine Arts, University of Tampa, Master of Fine Arts. I've never done anything like this, reading all these. West Virginia Wesleyan College, a Master's of Fine Arts, and most recently, an MFA from University of Georgia. Oh my God. And you told me offline that you do this in a traditional bricks and mortar setting. You actually go to the place.
Yes. Well, I'll give you kind of a quick overview of how this all came to being. When I was a young boy, I was diagnosed with very severe dyslexia. And so still today, I'm very dyslexic. So when I want to spell the word phone, intuitively, I think it should be spelled F-O-N. I'm a very logical speller and thinker. And so from a phonics perspective, it should be spelled phone, F-O-N. Psychology, your show, I think should be spelled with an S. Why is there a P? You don't say psychology, you say psychology. I was born in the month of October. To me, October should be the 8th month. An octagon or an octopus, octagon has 8 sides, octopus has 8 tentacles. October should be the 8th month. So there's a lot of odd and unusual reasons why we have these unique ways that we spell and organize our language. But when I was a young boy, It absolutely made no sense. And so for the first few years, I was born and grew up in Michigan. I went to a number of public and private schools. My mother was quite keen to see me find a place that would be a good match. And unfortunately, at the beginning of the year, I'd be put in some kind of gifted program or something like that. And then very quickly, I'd be moved to special education classrooms. And unfortunately, in the early 1980s, the people just really did not sufficiently understand learning disabilities and dyslexia. I think still today, there's a lot of misconceptions as well. It's getting better. And so my mother, who was a teacher herself, realized that it was necessary to homeschool me. In third grade, the teachers said, you're basically uneducatable. Not only do we think you are not college material, we don't think you're even going to graduate from high school. Well, they were right about that. I actually never graduated from high school. Still today, I don't even have a high school diploma. So I'm actually a grade school dropout and become quite proud of that. But my mother had the courage and really made incredible sacrifices to homeschool me. And so she had an old 1978 Ford F-150 pickup truck, grew up on a farm in Grand Haven, Michigan, and she took me everywhere and really believed that physically showing up and putting your hands on something and seeing it firsthand had real value. So if we were studying the American Civil War, we drove out to Gettysburg. And boy, I could really understand what happened specifically like at Pickett's Charge when you look at the topography and you actually walk the battlefield where people perished. I find it much more moving than just reading it in a textbook. When we were studying physics, we went down to Florida and we saw a space shuttle get launched. And gosh, I really got interested in understanding the mathematics and the scientific principles behind how that went up into space when you see it live. So I think to me, hands-on education was transformational. My mother really used a lot of very forward-looking educational principles, pedagogy, we might call it. And that was, for me, very important. She also really allowed me to have the space to play and be creative. Would say, I think, modern day education, we give way too many busy work assignments to students that do not encourage them to think critically and, more importantly, creatively. And my mother gave me a very generous amount of time to play and be creative and be imaginative. And that really cultivated me asking a lot of questions. Very proud of actually the first place that I was expelled from was actually preschool. I went to a kind of a preschool called Noah's Ark. And so, of course, the first day I asked the teacher, I was like, well, who's Noah? Tell me about this ark, right? And so then like, oh, this is a great teachable moments. They got everyone together in the class. And they kind of proceeded to tell this story of how animals from every continent kind of made their way to the ark and 2 by 2 got onto the ark. And I got a question. Yes. I'm like, how did the penguins and the koalas and the giraffes and how did they get to one? I mean, like the polar bears are probably not near where the ark is. Like, and they're like, look, it's a miracle. And I was like, okay, all right. And then I kind of went on with the story. I said, yes. I was like, I have another question. It's like, so 40 days and 40 nights. I'm like, correct. I'm like, but there's only 2 gazelles and there's only 2. The lions are going to get hungry. And how is this going to work? Like they're going to eat something. You eat the only 2 gazelles. Like what? Anyway, so the first day my mother came to pick me up and they're like, please do not bring back your son. And my mom, what happened? Was there some kind of altercation? And they're like, well, he asks too many questions. And my mom was like what? And they repeated the questions I asked her. She's like, those are great questions. I want to know the answers. At any rate, they're like, he's not a good fit. So ever since a young age, my mother has encouraged me to challenge assumptions, to ask uncomfortable questions and really get as deep into the issues as possible. And so homeschooling for me was an incredibly useful experience. I think homeschooling is great for many families if you have sufficient time and resources. And it really is an extraordinary commitment that's required on behalf of parents. So my mother did that for a number of years, and that was very good. And then kept asking a lot of questions. And my mother's like, well, I don't have the answers to all these questions. I mean, she's a very well-educated person, but there's limits to everyone. And so we began supplementing my homeschooling by taking classes at a local community college, Muskegon Community College. I also took classes at Grand Valley State University and Michigan State University. And I really benefited from all those institutions. I think community colleges, by the way, are a great resource that are not sufficiently respected in America. I think they're incredibly important. And so I earned a lot of credits while I was at Michigan Community College. In fact, I finished an associate's degree. And from that, then I transferred those credits to the University of Michigan. We moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan. And in addition, right now, I think we have a really good, successful football team at University of Michigan. But more importantly, it is a very large, small community. Ann Arbor is small, but the University of Michigan is very large. And literally, there's so many different courses and topics that you could study. I also recognize that universities, in addition to taking formal classes, have extraordinary lectures. A lot of guest lecturers from around the world will come to a university and speak. And so only taking classes for formal credit is just one part of the educational experience, but taking part of guest lectures, book talks, extracurricular activities, really thoroughly enjoyed the University of Michigan. I was fortunate to graduate with a 4.0. And I did that still while I was very young. After I finished there, I went on to become an intern at the White House for President Clinton. I really found that to be very productive. And then after that, I was still very young and I decided I wanted to go into graduate school. And I studied a number of places. I started at Yale Law School at age 19 and realized that I did not want to be a lawyer. Unfortunately, I think a lot of lawyers deal with conflict nonstop. And I just there's an important role that lawyers play, I'm sure, but not interested in surrounding my life with constant conflict. So I left for England and I was fortunate to study at Oxford and Cambridge. Very transformational experience. I really love that learning format, very similar to homeschooling. American education requires a lot of formal lectures and coursework. The Oxbridge system, Oxford and Cambridge, really allows people the time to study one-on-one with professors, with their tutors. But then you have generous amounts of time to sit in these historic libraries. Would be in libraries that are 3 times older than my country, the United States. It was just riveting. It was fascinating. And then after that, I came back to America and then studied at the various places that you listed. And each time I studied a different subject. I'm very curious. I think sometimes people read a book. I like to go, I like to go a little deeper. I love to, for example, I'm a big believer in the theory of multiple intelligences. Still today, we oftentimes look at intelligence as just quantitative and verbal, which is what the SAT and ACT evaluates. Traditional intelligence tests really look at that. Professor Howard Gardner just said, look, there's more than 2 categories. And he proposed 8. I think there might be even more than 8. But I had a chance to have one-on-one conversations with him multiple times when I was working on my master's and doctorate at Harvard. And so to me, it's not just the formal learning experience, but it's being involved in the community of learning. And I think that that's what's very important. But to be very clear, I think I've encountered so many brilliant people that have dropped out of school at various stages. I think the formal credentials are interesting. It's fine to get, but I think it's the learning environment. And I think what's exciting about the 21st century is that we are starting to avail ourselves of technology. Like, for example, Adam, you're on the West Coast, I'm on the East Coast, and we're able to have this great conversation. I really think we're bringing people together in very interesting ways with technology. So I think learning is going to be more democratized, more accessible, and more important than ever before.
Well, I love so many things that you said, and I want to comment on a variety of them. First off, yes, Julius and Augustus kind of screwed up the calendar. September means 7, October means 8, November means 9, and December means 10. Right. That's thing one. I totally agree with you on that. The idea of being dyslexic, I know very well. I am dyslexic. I was tested very well on the WISC, which is the measurement for children's IQs. They put me in the smart kids class, and I absolutely died. And I made my ways down to special education. They did not know what to do with me. I even languished in special ed. So there were no signs of anything going on academically for me. So many of my fellow students were shocked to learn that later in life I would go on and get a doctorate. You also mentioned the idea of firsthand experience. Calls to mind something I learned when I was at Yosemite, and John Muir, who was a naturalist who understood the land. He understood the valley better than anybody. And he came up with a hypothesis as to how Yosemite was formed. The modern scientists of the time had a vastly different hypothesis. Years later, after all of them had died, the man who had walked the valley and got to know the valley so intimately, his hypothesis was correct. The scientists of the time were not. So your mother and her idea of actually taking you to the place and giving you these firsthand experiences was totally genius. And here, but for the grace of your mother goes you, because had she not been in the mix and had she not understood at Noah's Ark that those were good questions, you would have just been seen as a failure because you were not a conformist. You were actually asking questions that made sense and you were being punished for that. And I think that this type of mishandling is sadly omnipresent.
Really dedicate any accomplishments I have to my mother. I think she was really very courageous to devote herself. Really, ironically, I think when we look at our curriculum in public schools, including high school, I don't think we spend enough time encouraging people to reflect on what is it going to take to be a good parent. You have a lot of knowledge from child psychology, and I think there's a lot of interesting things that are taught in high school, but one of them should be, what are some principles for how to be a really informed, active, thoughtful parent? And I think surprisingly, we don't spend enough time encouraging people. I mean, there's a lot of different pathways, but we don't encourage people to think about the intentionality behind being a parent. One thing you raise about dyslexia is I think there are so many dyslexics that I meet, and dyslexia is very different for many people. So just because I'm dyslexic or because you're dyslexic, we all experience learning differently. I think traditional schooling works great for people in the middle of the bell curve, however you want to think about it. But the reality is, if you think about clothing, something that's custom made, couture clothing that's measured and made tailor fit for yourself is always going to fit better than something that's off the rack. Sometimes for simply issues of finance and price, we have to go with off the rack type of stuff. But learning is very important. And I think the more you can customize learning for the needs of a student, whether it's yourself or a child that you have, is very important. And I do think with technology, with advancements in artificial intelligence and so forth, we can begin to really provide a more customized learning experience for more people. For me, homeschooling was great. The one-on-one interactions I had with faculty at Oxford and Cambridge was amazing. But I do think for anyone that's listening, I would say it's very important. If you think you're potentially dyslexic or have a learning disability, it's very important to get diagnosed, to really understand, to put a name with that. I also think, by the way, that what dyslexia is not really a disability, is a disability because our society is structured in a particular way. Just to use a metaphor, one of my favorite museums of all time is the Guggenheim in New York City that Frank Lloyd Wright designed. And when you go in it, I'm sure many of your listeners have already been, it's an upward spiral. And much of the museum does not have steps. So if you're in a wheelchair, it's universal access. It's designed in a very beautiful way. There's no compromise in the aesthetic qualities, but it's designed in a way that anyone with mobility issues can access many parts of the museum. I wonder why we can't design society in a way that is much more accessible, but very inclusive, but still has beauty and grace in it, like that museum. So I do think there's so-called learning disabilities, but that's in part because of the structures and barricades that we erect in our educational environments. For those people who are dyslexic and for anyone that didn't like school, I think learning fundamentally is fun. If you look at animals when they're just born, they love to learn. They love to learn how to walk. They love to play. Unfortunately, when we give people busy work, when we drown out the joy of learning, we become disengaged with it. And so from my experience, literally hated going to grade school when I was bullied, called a variety of terrible names, and teachers treated me horribly. And there was a moment where I could have completely been disengaged from learning in a formal environment forever. I think a lot of people encounter that, unfortunately, for a variety of reasons. So I do think that learning itself can be joyful, but we need to structure it in a way that really provides access and inclusion. And I fundamentally challenge all the busy work that's involved in school that has these mindless exercises. Computers are going to be much better at rote memory than we ever can. I mean, computers can memorize things and retain knowledge much more. In the 21st century, we need to be focusing not only critical analysis, but creative thinking. That's something that I think humans are best at. And that's what we need to work on more. So my own kind of learning journey has helped me kind of realize that we do need a lot of changes in learning, but I've certainly enjoyed participating, taught in college for a number of years. and it's something that I enjoy. I oftentimes think we need to challenge traditions and conventions that exist to allow more people to be included and really provide power boost for their future careers.
So many things that you've just said, Ben, just land, and I just want to get into them before I get to my next question. First off, learning is dopaminergic. We know that it's actually rewarding in and of itself, intrinsically. Just learning something new turns our brain on, gives us a shot of dopamine. It's good for us, and yet we get it beaten out of us to the point where Pink Floyd has "We Don't Need No Education." We resonate with that. Einstein once famously said, we don't need to memorize anything that we can look up. And posthumously, he's being shown to be more correct than ever before. The Guggenheim example, brilliant. We need to make that the model for education. Howard Gardner and his 8 and possibly more versions of intelligence. That changed my life when I learned about that. One-on-one learning, Alan Greenberger, whose memory is a blessing, he taught me firsthand. He was a history professor at my college. He took interest in me and the fact that I was not doing well. And he actually turned my brain from the off position to the on position. And it was brilliant. You have the most unusual perspective because you've been to 17 institutions and you understand pedagogy in a way that very few people ever could possibly imagine. What would be your notes to the learning system to get children engaged, to help them thrive? What are your thoughts on making education better?
So, and I've been to more than 17 because I've studied a lot of places and I learned, and then I've haven't necessarily finished the degrees. I'm like, at this point, I'm not worried about my resume. So I feel like, if I don't finish 1 or 2 degrees, I think it'll be okay. But one thing I think there's really, I would say early on in life, there's 2 strategic choices you can kind of make. I think there's people that are so-called Renaissance thinkers, Leonardo da Vinci, Thomas Jefferson, who certainly had a lot of flaws, but was incredibly accomplished as well. Was a great architect, built his own home, which is unbelievable, and not only founded the University of Virginia, but also was responsible for its principal architecture, but then also designed the architecture for our government, the founding of our government, and was a good diplomat as well as a leader of our country. That's a lot of skills. And there's very few people, I think, today that could be an architect and founder of a university and president of the United States and ambassador to a foreign country. But I do think that Renaissance thinking, in that sense, we can have polymath, if you want to call it, is a great thing to pursue for some people. In contrast, I do think at a young age, if you understand what your passion is, specializing and being very focused at a young age is extremely good. And I think we oftentimes just say, you can go through school in an unfocused way for a long time. I think that that's a mistake. I do think that you should be exposed to as much as possible at an early age, but then you do have to find a focus. Yo-Yo Ma did not start playing the cello late in life. He started young age, and he really was quite devoted to that. And when he became a student at Harvard, I don't think he was admitted because of his knowledge of Shakespeare or chemistry, right? It was because he already had a very established skills. In contrast, Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg, different generations. At a young age, they both demonstrated great focus and interest in computers, had differently excelled and so forth. So I do think that it's very important to encourage children to be very focused at a young age. And my mother exposed me to a variety of things, for sure. I did ballet for a number of years. I no longer do ballet, but that then transitioned into me being a very good fencer, which I did fencing, épée and saber and foil for a number of years. And so one skill built on another. And then eventually that led into other interests. I developed a deep interest in architecture and so forth. But I think what we need to do is encourage young people to go deep into something, not just at a superficial level, but really understand why, not just how does something work, but why does it work in a certain way. And so do you think our schools are not set up for that effectively, both at the K-12 level and also in college? We need to encourage deep mastery. And then if people have the bandwidth, deep mastery of multiple subjects. I think interdisciplinary studies is extremely interesting. And I think that that's very important future as well. So I think that is important. I also think that learning is a 24-hour experience. And so the way we have the semesters set up and so forth, I think is problematic. When I was homeschooled, I have two children that I'm homeschooling. Every day is a learning experience. We don't have artificial breaks and so forth. And our education system is structured around an agricultural calendar. Agricultural purposes, we would give summers off and so forth. How many of us, I still have a farm in Michigan, so I'm definitely consider myself a farmer, but how many of us are really full-time farmers? And so I do think the way we learn and the way we structure things is important, but it's not just about time. It's not just like investing more time in something. It's depth of focus and really dealing with people who are deeply knowledgeable. I think that with technology, we're allowing more direct contact with true experts. I think that that's very important. So I think mentorship, finding a good mentor is very important. One thing that I've been doing for a number of years, because I have been successful in getting admitted to a number of places, is for over 23 years, I've helped students prepare for rigorous college admissions. Start working with people when they're 10 or younger. Many people work with when they're beginning high school, but we live in such a competitive world that I don't think it's acceptable to just be unfocused. At a young age, you got to find a passion. And if you are passionless, then you need to be exposed to more opportunities so that you can find what is your calling in life and then really double down on that in a quick way. So I think that that's fundamentally important. Also think that regardless of if you're going to a public or private school or whatever circumstance, as a parent, you have to be the chief leader of your children. And I think a lot of parents outsource that responsibility to schools. Schools are great resources, but ultimately you have to be directly involved in your child's future. And I think that's unfortunate. Some people don't.
And I can tell that you take parenting very seriously, and I do as well. Being a father of two, and many of my listeners are parents or grandparents or have some relationship with children, what would you say are some of your best tips on parenting and cultivating a love of learning in general, maybe keeping the ball moving, keeping children interested who might become polymaths or the next Yo-Yo Ma's or in their field, so to speak? Like, what are some things that you hold near and dear in your day-to-day as you help your children become who they want to become?
Fundamentally learning how to ask good questions. I think that we have to encourage people to ask very difficult questions and then ask follow-up questions and more follow-up questions. Yeah, I do think there's advantages in the Socratic learning approach that's used in many law schools, but why don't we use that in grade schools? Why don't we use that at a very young age? My daughter at the moment is very interested in the violin. And so I've made great effort to connect her with, she's met Itzhak Perlman, she's met Joshua Bell, she's met Yo-Yo Ma, she's met people that are considered leaders, both in violin and music more broadly. She's met John Williams, one of the greatest living composers alive. Amazing. So those are extraordinary experiences. And so, but when she interacts or meets with those people, she asks very specific questions. For example, something that's not music related. Oh, and by the way, that's worked out. So she, at age 8 this year, has separately performed twice at Carnegie Hall solo performances, and she's gotten standing ovations both times. So I think, I don't know what her future will be, but she already at 8, twice at Carnegie Hall, she's on track to be doing reasonably well. But it's hyper competitive, right? It's hyper competitive. But the thing is, the minute she loses interest, we'll move on to something else. But right now, she's passionate about it. And so that's great. And I think music itself is like a language. So if you learn how to read and write music, you are learning another language. And who knows, maybe maybe somehow I don't think she has a great interest in computers right now, but maybe that knowledge and how to write music will lead her to better C++ or Java or Python coding in the future. Who knows, right? But it's like once you are thinking about different languages, you can transition. An example of good question asking is took her out to Las Vegas, took her to David Copperfield, very famous magician. I think you have to be a certain age in order to watch the show. She was definitely well under that age limit, but we snuck her in anyways. Sat in the front row, and he ends the show by having this kind of skeleton dinosaur appear. And she's really fascinating. Anyway, after the show, we went back and met Copperfield, and she's like, I have a question for you. And he's like, yes, little girl, do you want to see another magic trick? And she's like, no. What I want to know is all the magicians that are famous, Penn and Teller, David Blaine, David Copperfield, etc. They're all men. Why is there not a famous woman magician? And she asked that a question at age 6.
Wow.
I was like, that's a great question, right? I mean, name me another industry. I mean, where there's no famous women. For example, within the world of stand-up comedy, there's more men than women, but there's still some great female stand-ups. We think about world famous magicians, it's all men. And I was like, that's amazing. I was like, that's a great question. So that's a gap, and gap that should not exist. And so I was like, do you want to learn magic? She's like, maybe. So, but the point is, I think learning and education should be about moving things forward. And when you see an imbalance, you should try to identify that. And as a young girl, she's like, why are there female magicians? Now, as you're listening to this podcast, to the listeners, how many of you have thought about that? How many of you thought about why is there a gender imbalance in magic? I mean, okay, this isn't the greatest world problem that needs to be solved, but it is a problem. Women should not be the assistants to magicians, which they've oftentimes been relegated to in the past. So, I mean, my young daughter pointed out an inequality that I had overlooked. And so I was like, that's great. So I was like, that's why. So I want people of any age to ask more questions. And the more questions we ask, the more we uncover, and the more we like, look, let's fix this. This is not an unfixable problem. So that is the type of education that I think is very important, is to just organically ask questions and just allow your imagination to flow freely and say, all right, I'm looking at this on stage, or I'm looking at this playing out, but why aren't other people involved? And getting that inclusion.
What's even more fascinating to me, frankly, than the specific question your daughter asked, it's the hours behind the process that allowed her to ask such a good question at the age of 6. I find myself imagining, like, what would dinner be like at Ben's house? What would a car ride with him and his daughter be like? What types of things is he doing to nurture her questioning nature? And you mentioned the Socratic method. For the listeners, can you describe like how you do that at the dinner table, or perhaps when you're driving or taking a walk with her, or engaging with her in a lesson itself to go well beyond the lesson and the mere target that you're shooting at?
So I think there's value in having things structured. And there's some people, some listeners that love to be very structured about life.
Sure.
Generally, the very opposite of that. Think that you should have strategic goals, but at a tactical level, just let things organically unfold. And so let's say we go on a walk and we look at some leaves, right? And that can lead to a discussion of deciduous versus conifers, like different reasons why some trees have leaves that fall off and some, like pine trees, have needles that don't. In other words, when I wake up today, I might not have like a forestry lesson prepared or thought about, but if we're walking and she's like, it's fall now, there's beautiful leaves out in New England, and it's like, why does this work this way? Also then lead to an astronomy lesson. Well, because we don't orbit around the sun exactly in a perfect circle. We actually are on an axis, and it's more of an oval shape orbit. And because of these reasons, we have different seasons. And I mean, so just looking at a leaf, a beautiful leaf on the ground, can lead to a discussion about differences in trees, can lead to astronomy and how we have different seasons, and also environmental sustainability. So all those things can go in different directions. And I think what's important is we don't say, well, wait, we only have 45 minutes for this. We only have an hour for this, and now we're going to move on to another subject. We just keep exploring and exploring and exploring, and then let that interconnectivity naturally flow. So maybe we talk about trees for a little bit. When I was a young boy on our farm, my mother planted several acres by hand of red pine trees. She's like, all right, let's grow a forest. You be involved. So when I go back now, it's like I see these trees that are well taller than me. It's so rewarding to see that, right? It's like that. I learned so much by physically doing that, by understanding how much do you have to water a tree? And then how much care does it take for a tree to grow, et cetera. So when I'm homeschooling, either my son or daughter, we just allow for questions to flow from one topic to another. And we don't say, okay, well, we only have 2 hours for this. Now we have to move on to another topic. We might spend a whole week on one subject, but that subject is going to flow into other areas and other topics organically. Yes. And I think that if you don't force something, but you allow asking questions, and we really talk about the Socratic method. I mean, I'm really just talking about asking purposeful and intentional questions. I think never giving a young child a short or flippant answer, but giving someone say, like, that's a great question. And let's really explore that. And sometimes as adults, we don't know the answers to those questions either. Let's not be dismissive. Let's like jump in and learn. I think that that's what is incredibly important. And if you think about some of the great innovations that we have, we overlook things like how many years got into yellow taxi cabs and were dissatisfied with the experience. And then Uber and Lyft came around and really made our economy much more dynamic and allowed more people to have an income stream from that and really democratized taxi cabs or the delivery service. That's great, right? But how many people saw a problem? Wait, is there a better way to do this or not? So I think the great disruptive innovations are people just noticing a problem, then really asking, like, is this necessary? Do we really, really need to do it this way? And so many of us, as we get older and as adults, we just accept things as a status quo. We're like, well, this is the way it has to be. I don't think it necessarily has to be that way. I think, for example, if we look at voting, a lot of people feel disengaged from that. I don't know. I think we have very successful people do online banking. And I mean, there's sure there are ways to improve it, but we make secure transactions that way. Isn't there a way that we can make our voting process more inclusive using digital technology? Certainly, we want it to be secure. I know there's all those concerns, but I'm just saying, I think there's a lot of ways that we get stuck in traditions. And I mean, traditions are important, but some of them aren't. And so, look, I never believed that Santa Claus was real because when I was a boy, we had a chimney and we had a farmhouse. And so we actually had a burning furnace that it kept us a little cold in the wintertime. But just was like, okay, well, how long does it take for a sleigh and reindeer to land on the roof? All right. So like, if they're really quick, it's going to take at least a few minutes, right? Because they got to land. He has to get off. I don't know how he's going to fit in the chimney, but he's going to go down the chimney and then he's going to leave a gift or two by the tree. So that at least is going to take 2 or 3 minutes. I mean, realistically, 5 or 7 minutes. And I was like, okay, now how many, and I'm Grand Haven, Michigan, small town. I was like, well, how many houses are there here? There's more than 10,000 houses. All right. So now how many hours are there in a day? How many minutes? And I did the math. I was like, there's no way that he can even visit all the houses in Western Michigan, let alone Michigan or the United States. I was like, yeah, it can't work. So I just quickly was like, Santa Claus isn't real. When my daughter had a similar, she just kind of like did the math in her head and she's like, this isn't real. And I was like, you're right. It's not real, but it's fun. I was like, this is a fun little, thing. But I wasn't like, oh, it's really real. I was like, no, it's not. But we still get into Christmas. We still wish people Merry Christmas. But I think treating people like an adult at a young age and be like, yeah, this isn't real, but it's fun. Like we're still going to dress up in costumes for Halloween, but you're not really Harry Potter when you put the scarf. I think people can handle things and still find joy in them. And so I always ask people, I was like, when did you really think that Santa, and people be like, oh yeah, I really thought Santa Claus existed. I'm like, really? I was like, I never thought that. Right. And so, I mean, I think there's just different ways, but I do think treating young people with maturity and respect is very important. And I've never talked to my children in baby talk. We've always talked with them as an adult and they have adult goals. So
I'm going to pivot a bit. And since you were talking about Santa Claus and the improbable nature of him being able to do all of that in such short time, I'd like to talk with you about you doing improbable things in such short time. Between the years 2000 and 2004, you actually acquired 6 degrees from places like Stanford, Columbia, Harvard, Brown, Dartmouth. How did you, just kind of going from the infinite to the prosaic, like how in the world did you make that work in terms of a human schedule?
Well, I'll give you an example. When I was at Columbia, I did 2 graduate degrees that are each meant to be done separately, concurrently, and within 1 year. And many people will take like 16 or 18 or 21 credits a semester. I think I was taking more than 40 credits. I think one semester I took 42 credits, something like that. Fairly significant. I still graduated at the top in both programs. Part of it, I think, is you need to be more focused and efficient with your time. So, for example, how many listeners, no matter where you are in your learning journey, how many of you have taken a class on how to take notes? I think there's several different approaches to note taking, and some people actually don't need to take notes. So one of the ways that we learn is kinesthetic learning, kind of is a fancy word for touch. And so literally some people, the act of writing actually helps them with their memory. Yeah. When I was severely dyslexic, I used what was called the Orton-Gillingham method, which I recommend, which is a way of helping people learn to read and spell. And one technique they use with young children is they literally put a tray of sand in front of you, and you will write out a word in the sand. And the purpose of that is you're actually feeling the sand, the texture of those granules. And that helps your memory for some people. So at an extreme level, like literally writing in sand helped me to learn the different, like pH will make the F sound under some circumstance. So I learned that by writing out pH and then underlining it and saying, and then I was able to learn that. That doesn't work for everyone. But my point is that when it comes to note taking, many people who are note takers, not for any fault of their own, but they just never intentionally thought, how do I take good notes? Or why am I taking notes? Or when do I need to do that? If you go to business school, a lot of business schools, you'll give them these like very lengthy case studies, and you have to get through all this content. It'll be 30 pages, and really only 15% of the content that you're reading is seminal or really critical to the discussion you'll have or the write-up that you have to make. So I learned very quickly how to efficiently look through a book, efficiently how to listen to a lecture. And so like literally I would in real time be committing things to memory. So I think when you learn how to learn, you can be extraordinarily productive. But again, something I would challenge you. Most of us spend so much time learning content, whether it's history or anthropology or physics or whatever the topic is, but rarely in grade school or high school or college or even graduate school do we spend a considerable amount of time thinking about how do we learn and how do you specifically learn? Again, another metaphor, there's PC operating systems and Mac operating systems and so many other types of systems. We're blessed to have different operating systems. And so you cannot program for a Mac using a PC approach. I mean, you have to understand the language or the operating systems that's being used. Ironically, I think we spend more time thinking about the operating systems of our computers that we own than how we think. Mm-hmm. And so I certainly invest time in that. And when I work with my children or other people, I really invite them to say, like, let's think about how do you think, which is always very unique. And I think that's great. Just like everyone's fingerprint is unique, which is a good thing. The way we learn is actually there's similarities, but everyone has a unique learning approach. And I really encourage people to be more intentional on that. And if you do, you can unlock unbelievable efficiencies. I know everyone's heard of these things like we only use X percentage of our brain and so forth. Well, I think that's true. And I think that there's ways to realistically unlock more productivity. And so I do think that I was more efficient in graduate school than others, but I don't think that's unrepeatable. I think if you really think about understanding how you learn and are intentional, you can be much more productive. And also, you also have to understand, like, what do you want to get out of learning? I mean, a teacher may have as a goal, okay, well, we got to prepare for some exam. Well, that's great. So, I mean, it's nice to get A's. So why not learn and master that? That's great. But also, when you're there, you have to say, why am I here? And what do I want to learn? And then how am I later going to use this in an applied way? I really do believe that's why I've loved being a professor and a teacher and having other teaching roles for so many years, is that when you teach others, I think it's one of the most active ways to learn, is because you have to explain what you think you understand of something to others. And then you have to, I hope, invite rigorous questioning.
Yep.
Well, gosh, that is a learning process of itself. I'll just mention a couple resources for people if they're interested in this. One of the great educators that I've long admired is Paulo Freire, and he wrote a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed from Brazil, South American context. But he really helps people kind of question how we structure learning, which I think is very, very important. Another book for those who are maybe dyslexic is a book called In the Mind's Eye, written by Thomas West. And he profiles a number of dyslexics from Winston Churchill onwards. And when you have a learning difference or a learning disability, you see the world in a different way. And because you see the world in a different way, you sometimes approach problem solving in a different way. You recognize problems in a different way, and then you find solutions in a different way. Winston Churchill, what a great orator. I mean, very, very effective at persuading people. And think about, unless you're a professional mime, name me a profession that does not require good presentation skills, be able to persuade people effectively. But that's pretty critical. I mean, even if you're making a PowerPoint presentation, you have to be able to speak effectively. But how many of us have, in whatever schooling we've had, have had a class in oratory skills? When I was at Oxford, and at Cambridge, I think the best learning I had was, again, not in the classroom. I joined the Oxford Union and the Cambridge Union, and the many hours I spent debating friends and colleagues there, that was the best education I had, because I learned the skill of rigorously debating people and having an argument and then a counter argument and then a counter argument to that. And that was great, right? But that wasn't anything formally required, but that was a powerful learning experience. So I do think when we talk about being involved in so-called extracurricular activities, they're very important. You need to be very intentional what you're doing. I think all those should be interconnected for people that have kids in grade school and high school and college. Those things are quintessential part of your learning experience. They're not additions. So I do think having focus, I think thinking about how your brain works, we can learn a lot from fMRIs, looking at the physical structure of brains, the psychological structure of brains. But then one other plug I would say for positive psychology. So much of traditional psychology focuses on our limitations and our dysfunctions and our flaws. And I think there's a role for that. I mean, clearly there's sometimes a need to think about that. But again, one of my favorite athletes is Tom Brady. And I've spent a lot of time in Boston, so I do like the Patriots. And there was one Super Bowl a few years ago where in the third quarter, they were down by several scores.
I remember
more than
it well,
21
man.
points. And at that point, third quarter down way more than 21 points against a great team, people would say, like, this is lost. This cannot be
done.
It's done. And they came back and they won. So look, you can't be unrealistic. I mean, humans can't fly just as we're born, but we can sure invent jets that will take us to the sky and spacecraft that will take us beyond our planet. So I think, like Tom Brady, you have to be realistic, but unbelievably optimistic. And you have to push yourself more than you think you can push yourself. And so Julian Edelman or Tom Brady or those people, they turned what everyone would have said was a clear loss into an amazing victory. So I think that's a powerful metaphor. I think it's very important that you have to be unbelievably realistic, but you also have to be amazingly optimistic. And I think so many people themselves or their parents or people around them place limitations on themselves. They say, I can't do this. Or someone says, Ben, be realistic. You can't do that. Why not? Frank Lloyd Wright, I think one of America's greatest architects, never really studied architecture. He studied engineering, but he didn't really have a formal education in architecture, right? But I mean, he built things other people said can't stand. He built a very successful hotel that was one of the few buildings that survived in Japan after a big earthquake. Everyone said, oh, you're building it a weird way. He's like, it's going to work. Trust me. And his building, the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, survived when most things collapsed. We have to not limit ourselves. And I think that's one of the, if I could say anything to people listening, is that we artificially place roadblocks and dead ends in our way. Don't jump off a cliff thinking you can fly, because you can't, right? So you have to be grounded in reality, but you also have to push yourself farther and faster than most people think is possible. And I think that's how we set records. And I think that's how we set personal goals that we can then achieve.
Love that. And Ben, what compelled you to do this massive undertaking of so many degrees? And what have you received as a result of this seemingly quixotic pursuit, except for the fact that you are evidence that this was not quixotic in any way, shape, or form?
Well, I'll answer a quick story. When I graduated from Dartmouth, you walk on stage and they give you this green tube. Dartmouth's, one of its colors are green, the big green. So you give this green tube, and I just assumed wrongly that the diploma was in the green tube. As I shook the hand of the president, and then my family and we took hundreds of photos that day and everything. I was like, oh, this is great. And then I put the green tube in a banker's box. And I was like, that's great. By the way, I have none of my degrees hanging. They're all just like in some storage box. To me, education is in yourself. It's not on a wall. And so the registrar's office contacted me several years later, and they're like, hey, you want to pick up your degree? And I was like, what? And yeah, the tube is empty. We just give you the tubes for the photos. You have to stop by and actually pick up the degree. And I was like, okay. And I was like, okay, yeah, next time I go for a Dartmouth football game, I'll pick it up. They're like, okay, sure. And ironically, all the football games are on Saturdays. Of course, registrar's office is closed when I travel to Hanover. So I think to this day, I haven't still picked up that diploma. I think it's still gathering dust. The point is, why do I do this? Look, I think it's fun to have a certain amount of graduate degrees and so forth. That's great. But when I was very young, I asked myself, I said, and my first US patent at 13, I asked myself, like, if I was a billionaire this moment, which I'm not, but if I was a billionaire, what would I want to do with my time? And learning is something I would always want to be doing. If I had unlimited wealth, I would always like to be learning. I've been blessed to have dinner at Stephen Hawking's house. That's, to me, an amazing, magical experience to actually have a conversation one-on-one with one of the most brilliant minds in physics. I've been so fortunate. My mother took me to meet Gloria Steinem when I was a young boy.
Wow.
Gosh, I learned a lot about the women's movement and what feminism means. And so as a father raising a daughter, my daughter's met Gloria Steinem and Jane Fonda. And I mean, so it's like, let's learn directly from icons who have questioned and challenged society. So to me, learning is enjoyable. Even if I meet people I disagree with, I especially enjoy meeting people that I entirely disagree with, because sometimes you meet people that you intellectually disagree with, but they're very decent people and they're a joy to talk with, even though you completely disagree with their ideas. So to me, I think that that's very important. With my daughter, I take her up to New Hampshire all the time, right? There's New Hampshire primary, very famous. People running for president still have to walk into a diner and shake hands in a small environment. My daughter's met Elizabeth Warren, who for a moment could have been the first woman president. She's met Hillary Clinton. She's met Nikki Haley. She's met people on both sides who are great women leaders that will have a role in our government and in leadership. So I think there's nothing replacing that. So why do I do this? I love to learn. And one part of my learning is formal education. That's important. I love that. But I think just waking up in the morning and just asking a question and then trying to find the answer to that. That's how I think that's the greatest entrepreneurs. You're out in California. There's such a great concentration of entrepreneurs in San Francisco, or at least they end up there. They all challenged assumptions. They all said, gosh, there has to be a better way to do this. And I think no matter where you are in life, even if you're in mid-level management in a big corporation, there's always ways to find better ways to do things. And I think just accepting that the status quo is not permanent and understanding that everything is going to change. There was a time in life where it was prestigious, or at least it was an important role to be an elevator operator. Elevators, you just couldn't push a button. There was a guy, usually it was a guy, who would operate the elevator, and they were sophisticated pieces of technology. It's like planes. We don't really have many self-driving planes. Pilots are very prestigious. They help us fly safely. Same was true for elevators, right? Except for very wealthy Upper East Side abodes. How many elevator operators are there still in the world today? Very few. Things change. But right now, we have pilots. They're flying planes. 100 years from now, is our airline industry going to look the same? Probably not. So I think the point is that in addition to challenging the status quo, it is comforting to get stuck in routines. It's very comforting. But the reality is nothing stays the same. Everything is open to change. And I think if we embrace that with joy as opposed to fear, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty, but if we embrace uncertainty with a certain amount of joy and caution, I think you can be very successful. And so I've always accepted that change is permanent. And so for that reason, I accept it.
And I'm getting, just from the way you present yourself, some of the things that probably drove you to pursue all these degrees, incredible amounts of curiosity, just a love of learning, as you said. And I'm also kind of getting what you got, in addition to some of the upside of this so-called learning disability of dyslexia. Somebody recently referred to me as a human Rube Goldberg machine. And I thought that was very nice, because I do have a kind of a different way of seeing things. Part of that is probably my neurodiverse presentation. I find myself, though, wondering if you could just be even a little more granular about what did you get from studying such diverse topics at such high levels from such great institutions. What are some of the non-tangibles that you walk around with all day in spite of having an empty green tube?
It really is directly interacting with people that have discovered knowledge and talking with them and talking about the moments they had breakthrough insights. To me, office hours are the most valuable time. Or sitting down for lunch or dinner and having a conversation. I mean, literally having dinner with Stephen Hawking is something that was amazing. Or having dinner with Howard Gardner, who pioneered the theory of multiple intelligences, which everyone says is a great idea, but very few put into implementation. From a physicist to an educator, talking with people, having this type of conversations is very important. We remember William Julius Wilson, a great sociologist who studied poverty and racism in Chicago for many years. In grad school, worked under him in a course and had these great office conversations with him and talked with him during a meal. And I learned so much more because what people publish in books, they have to double and triple check. And sometimes they don't always publish everything they think. But then when you talk to an author afterwards and say, well, what did you leave out? What was on the cutting room floor when you're editing things? To me, that's even more interesting. So it's those type of stories. I loved Star Wars as a kid, right? And so ended up listening to the conversation that Bill Moyer had with Joseph Campbell.
So good.
On the Hero of a Thousand Faces. But, when I was learning about all that great kind of mythology, I also incidentally learned that George Lucas, when he made the first, this is probably a famous story, probably a lot of people know this, but when he was making the original Star Wars film, people said, well, there's no sequel. There's going to be no there's no lunch boxes or merchandise. I mean, this is a one movie deal. And so he gave up part of his director's fee, which I think was like $50,000, which is like or so whatever amount it was. Is a lot of money at the time in the 70s. And he said, look, if you don't think this is going to become of anything, give me the rights to any sequels and any merchandising. And they said, done deal. Like, you're a sucker. This film is going to go nowhere. And he said, okay, great. So then I'll give up some of my director's fee if you will give me the rights to that. And he believed in himself when everyone else didn't. And how many sequels have there been to Star Wars and how much merchandising has there been? But the point is, he believed in himself and he learned how to structure a deal. I know Donald Trump claims to have the art of the deal or whatever, and maybe he does, who knows? But George Lucas, I think that's a great deal that he structured. I learned a lot from that story as a boy, hearing that story about George Lucas. I was like, look, you always have to bet on yourself. And he did. Whatever it was, it was 50,000, whatever the amount was, that was a lot of money. But he's like, look, I'm going to take the bet and believe that not only am I going to be a one hit, but I'm going to have multiple hits. And I'm going to invest in that, and it gives me an opportunity. So I think never close down opportunities. You have to think about the value of opportunity costs. Always extend options for yourself. And that's something that George Lucas did. And I think that made him a great innovator. Also, if something doesn't exist, create it.
Yep.
Like, he wanted to do these amazing special effects that didn't exist. Like, how do you put the Millennium Falcon into hyperspace? I don't know. So he literally created a company into Light and Magic, get the special effects. And then how many other films like Jurassic Park, all these other things were a result of the technology company that he created in order to make all these movie special effects. So what I'm saying is, I don't think when he wrote the Star Wars script did he plan to create Industrial Light and Magic, but in order to get from point A to point B, he had to innovate. And I think that's the genius of having an unplanned but very open-minded life, is that sometimes to go from A to B, you have to visit all these other stops that are incredible and will lead to other amazing things as well. And so I think I've always tried to embrace that in my life with my children and anyone I talk with or teach or mentor. Is it's very important to be open to opportunities. It's unbelievable how oftentimes opportunities will knock on your door, but you're so focused on going right here and you don't realize, well, gosh, we need to take a few other paths along the way. So, I mean, there's a lot of people that say, how do you get to become successful? Is it luck or is it skill? Obviously, it's both. And you have to create your own opportunities. And I don't know if that's luck or what do you want to call it, but you have to create it intentionally, and then you have to be observant and see things as they're unfolding. It's like the Netflix guys. They started sending discs through the mail, and then they're like, well, let's go to streaming. I don't know how much visionary they were, but they're like, look, if we just stay stuck in this one paradigm, we're going to miss another. And maybe we want to get to another paradigm, but we have to go through this other stage. That's very important in life. And I think so many of us hear that and we see that, but we don't embrace it ourselves. And I think if we can actually internalize that, it's very important. So as people are listening to this podcast, don't just say, oh, well, that's an interesting guy, but that doesn't apply to me. It applies to you. If you're listening to this, there's no reason. I'm sure there's things that you want to accomplish that you haven't yet done. Don't wait a decade to do it. Do it now. Like do not delay your dreams. No matter how old or young you are, do not be the roadblock. Let others be a roadblock and then find ways around it. But I really think, unfortunately, we place limitations on ourselves. And my daughter, she's like, I want to learn the violin. And she had said at age 7, Daddy, do you think I can play twice at Carnegie Hall next year? I'd be like, yes, I think you can. Right. I was like, okay, what is it going to take? And then very incrementally went forward to that. And we found the right mentors and tutors. But it's important to say yes. I think that's the very first step at a granular level. Accepting the invitation for success and say yes is important. And so many people say no.
So good. And there are many things that you said that I loved, one of which is the things that make the cutting room floor very interesting. I would love to see all of the scenes of Star Wars that didn't make it. I have a feeling that they'd be incredible. Boba Fett was kind of a throwaway character, and everyone is so fascinated with Boba Fett, so much so that they had to create an entire series based on him. But when I think about the greatest conversations of all time, the Bill Moyers, Joseph Campbell conversation, maybe the greatest conversation between two people I have ever heard. I've listened to it multiple times. Each time I get something different from that conversation. Bill Moyers, the ultimate question asker, the best facilitator of great conversation. And Joseph Campbell, a man who knew just so much and had so many reference points, and how it informed the great George Lucas in creating the best story ever told. And I love what you said about him from a business perspective. And there's so many angles to really think about Star Wars. I've been thinking about Star Wars this entire conversation, interestingly, because one of the things you said is that you didn't try to force something with your daughter. And I thought, well, instead he trusted the Force, just like was said in the show. And so I can see how oftentimes I get pigeonholed in an idea. And this is the solution I'm seeking when there are probably 99 better solutions out there, but I'm so narrow-minded in what I'm looking for at Home Depot or wherever it is that I'm going for the solution that I'm missing out on 99 better options. And I think that's a really important mindset to hold.
Just one quick addition to that is I think you got to be open to failure. This is not like you look to try to fail, but I think so often we want our children to be perfect and we want perfect grades. And we want everything to be perfect. And failure is an important part. You think about the Star Wars original trilogy. Luke confronts Darth Vader in Empire Strikes Back and loses. He literally falls almost to his death at the end of the movie. Failure is something that we can learn from. And I have certainly failed many times. Maybe we'll save that for another podcast. But really think if you look at all the great creators and entrepreneurs and so forth, everyone fails. But it's important to accept failure and to not give up. Another person that I admire is Thomas Edison, and an incredible inventor. But what you also have to admire is the amount of failed attempted inventions that he had. And the only reason he was so prolific is that he embraced learning from something that didn't work out. I think that is very, very important. And a lot of times we try something and it doesn't work out and then we give up. And I think you can never do that. I think if you truly believe in something, the script, the Forrest Gump, got rejected by many studios dozens of times. And then what a great movie that turned out to be. So really believe no one should ever look at a story. And I think we sometimes curate in social media these days like a perfect lifestyle, which is unrepresentative. The reality is anyone who's successful fails. And again, just to go back to Tom Brady, so I mentioned him, he was not the number one draft pick. He takes great pride in being way at the bottom of the draft and then being an understudy as a professional and then getting one moment, getting a chance and then finding his break. But the point is, do not be disengaged by the fact that you fail or people think that you can't do it. Find inspiration in that. I'm sure when I was being bullied in grade school and being told terrible names, that I was an idiot, that I was all these other really horrible names, did that fuel my desire to find academic success? I'm sure it did, but then at some point I let go of that. And I do think that you need to let go of negativity. And I really think you have a short life. Just give you one other example that I think is very important. My parents got divorced. I love both my parents, but my father was very rough on me and very rough on my mother. And I did not have the closest relationship with him for a period of time. He was diagnosed with a grade 3 glioblastoma brain tumor, very serious, very aggressive brain tumor in 2004. And the first hospital he was taken to was in Flint, Michigan. And no disrespect to Flint, but it's a city, as I'm sure you've heard in the news, that hadn't even had good running water that's safe to drink for a period of time. So it's not necessarily the best place for medical interventions. It doesn't have the best resources in some places. And so I really had to make a choice. Am I going to step in and help my father, or am I just going to let him be where he is? And I said, you know what? He's my father. And he wasn't perfect in many ways, but he's still my father. I still love him. I'm going to step in. And I'm not a medical doctor, but I started reading a variety of medical journals. First, we got him transferred to the University of Michigan, get an immediate surgery there. I then tracked down pioneering researchers at Duke Brain Tumor Center, at Dana-Farber, we ended up getting on multiple innovative clinical trials. And I had medical journals trained that, but I'm like, look, this can't be that hard. Let's figure this out. I started reading about Avastin, CPT-11, different treatments. And I said, all right, let's try these different innovative approaches. He lived for 11 years.
Wow.
Instead of 3 to 6 months. And
Wow.
so, and again, I just was like, look, let's read about where the research is going and let's get them to places that are where there's some innovative approaches. So what I'm saying is you don't have to be an expert in something. I never had studied medicine before, but I was like, these journals have English. So there's some Latin in it too, but let's figure this out. And I just logically put these things together. And so just like, when COVID-19 started, and everyone was saying it's just a problem on the surfaces. I was like, well, how's it going to get on the surface? It has to be airborne, right? Is it like we just originally just like watch out for the surfaces? So I was one of the first people to get a N95 and even an N100 mask because I was like, this is probably airborne and we're probably going to breathe it in. And it took them a bit of time for them publicly to acknowledge that, at least in the US. So I'm just saying, I think we use a little bit of logic, a little rationale. We can solve our own problems. Common sense is very valuable. And I think sometimes we miss common sense.
And it's so uncommon, and there's such a chasm between what we know and what we do so often. I'm going to have to, just for the sake of time, go to my final question with you, my man. But this is so much fun. You were just so living in my geek zone. If you had Dumbledore's wand, so to speak, and could confer upon all humanity magically one skill or insight that would dramatically improve the quality of life of individuals and perhaps by extension, society at large, what would that skill or insight be? And how do you imagine it would impact the individual as well as perhaps society?
I'd always want more than one thing, of course. But if I was really limited to one thing, I'd probably have a few, but I think one of these would be the power of listening. Because I think so often people say things that we don't hear. And one of the professions I'm most impressed by are veterinarians. Because if you're a human doctor, you go, I think I broke my ankle. Okay, well, now we're in the ER. Let's take an x-ray of your ankle. If you're a veterinarian, whether you're a small or large animal veterinarian, the animal oftentimes can't articulate what's wrong. And you really have to be observant. You have to listen to the animal in order to help them. And listening, it involves a lot of different skills, not just your ears. I really think we have these terrible areas in the world that have just incredible conflict. On both sides, people are just being devastated. But I do think there are incredibly inspiring examples. In Northern Ireland, which many people thought was an intractable situation. Yes. We have peace. We have peace in Northern Ireland. Is there conflict there? Sure, there's still tension. But gosh, it's a lot better than it was a while ago. Many people said we could never find peace in Northern Ireland. We've made incredible progress in Northern Ireland. And that was accomplished by both sides hearing each other and listening. You're not going to get total agreement, but listening to both sides and understanding that both sides are human beings, very important. Think about another example, South Africa, apartheid South Africa, one of the most evil moments in our history of the world. And the power of forgiveness can't undo the past, but we can listen. Truth and reconciliation. We can listen to what the truth is. It's important to understand and get the truth out and then forgive and find a way to move forward. Very hard. But listening to others, even those you disagree with, is incredibly difficult. And especially in the modern era where we can surround ourselves with curated social media and news, we listen to what we want to hear. I listen to CNN and Fox News and Newsmax and all these different channels intentionally. I want to hear what's being said on the spectrum. I might not agree with everything that's said. I might even disagree that some things are facts, but it's important to listen. And I think the only way, no matter what industry or interest you have, whether it's politics or education or entrepreneurship, the only way that you're going to succeed, I think, is if you listen. And I think great entrepreneurs listen to what's missing. They hear what's not being said. And that is a skill itself. So listen to what's said, listen to what's not being said, have a heart, have empathy, and invest in yourself. But I think that's a great skill. If you can just learn to listen slightly better. And if someone says something, acknowledge what they've said and ask a follow-up question. Because sometimes what they first say is not what they really want to say. They're looking for a way to start a conversation. Sit down and listen with intentionality. That's a great skill.
I couldn't agree more. I've had Julian Treasure on my podcast, and he is a listening expert. I've also had Didine Umunyana, who comes from Rwanda, where things were intractable as well. And through listening, the Tutsi and the Hutu tribe now, which was an artificial delineation to begin with from Europeans, they are now getting along great. I'm so grateful to speak with you, Ben, and I'm grateful to my son for introducing us indirectly. And this has been a blast learning from you.
It's wonderful. And if any of the listeners want to reach out and contact me, if you just Google Ben Bolger, I have a website and everything, you can track it down. I love talking with people and I really appreciate folks listening to this. Thank you for hosting really an incredible discussion. And I just leave everyone with a thought. Before you go to sleep tonight, dream of what you really want to do with your life. And if you're not doing it, figure out a way to do it. Life is incredibly short. No matter how old you are, it's moving by quicker than you think. Do not delay your dreams, but find a very practical way to get to them and do it now.
Beautifully said. Thanks, Ben.
Great talking with you, Adam. Very nice.
This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.